Welcome to the broadcast. This episode is about bloodlines, ancient power structures, extra-dimensionals, and ETs throughout history, Annunaki and Nephilim, as well as secret societies and mystery schools. So first we will start with an initial history. Now, the story of the Annunaki is mostly accurate. However, there are certain contextual and, essentially really key things that are just blatantly wrong. So, the literal meaning of the gold mine and gold, and for those who are unaware, the initial translation of the ancient Sumerian tablets describes Anunnaki, these beings, these demigods, and it accurately translates many things, but the contexts of the gold, there's said to be that humanity was created by the Anunnaki, and they were created as a slave race to mine gold for their atmosphere, and it's silly. It's frankly silly. It's the context of the gold and the precious thing. That is something that I'm going to get into. So, and it was said to sustain them, this precious thing that was mined through toil and labor, the suffering of the human race. But it is important to have a proper context and a proper history to provide that context, a frame in which to understand how these events unfolded and for what reasons. So, the Anunnaki are, again, they're essentially, however you want to define it, you could say they're demigods, you could say they're gods, lowercase g sort of thing, and Nephilim, I will say, is it's a completely another meaning, completely separate definition. So the Anunnaki, literally, in the context of ancient history, in particular, formative ancient history, refers to a species, I guess you could say, of, not really a species, because it's not an evolutional thing. They are interdimensionals who, through a process of careful selection and will attunement, they spiritually seed into designated bodies, human bodies. And these were adult human bodies who, at the time of human evolution, were quite advanced for their standing and very rare. So there was 100 some such humans who came together from all various places of the earth. They magnetized, culminated into this group And they were told what was going to happen, obviously by being connected to the divine will. So, the spiritual seeding process required the pathways. In order to actually go down a circuit, you need to be the proper frequency to transverse that circuit. And this, in a literal energy context. You know, and think electricity, if you plug in just because it's the right charging cord, just because you see that it'll fit the hole, it might not be the right voltage and amperage, and you might end up having a bad time. In a more spiritual sense, you have to have your will aligned. If your will is not aligned with the divine will, then you can't do certain things. It's just impossible. It's just not even in the realm of possibility. And even when you are aware of the pathways, even if you have the knowledge, the Gnosis, you still do not possess the mana. Now the mana, or the hatha, they both, you know, all these terms for the right way of living enlightenment. What do you think it is that it is enlightened? It is pathways in your DNA. And so these people, these human beings, they were genetically receptive because of their state of mind. And you could, whatever, it's a chicken and egg scenario, right? But that is the context. And it was a joint effort with different interdimensionals, many different, you could say, species of interdimensionals, right? But then this junction of the two, they went on to become, so essentially the human being lived on in the mind, like essentially their experiences, right, and their memories and stuff, but their actual literal soul and their consciousness, you could say, became, you know, they went off to their paradise journey. They played their part, straight up. But these corporeal, interdimensional Anunnaki, they had access to their genetic memory, obviously. So they knew what it was to be human through them, through their lived experiences in their bodies. Now the bodies became modified, as well as their genetic code, no longer existing in just it existed now in a 12-dimensional frequency array, which, as you begin to understand crystal memoraphonics, I will say, you will see how a 12-dimensional interface is, it is high quality, let's just say that. That's some high fidelity shiznaz right there. So, that's what a DNA crystal is. But, crystals, am I right? Moving on from crystals, the actual genetic interface, it allowed them to have direct access to certain, shall we say, spiritual technologies that prolong life inevitably. And this technology is a fruit of the tree of life that grows in a higher place. But it is also a physical tree at this time. And, you have the symbolism and the actual geometry of the tree of life and the Kabbalah. But the tree of life itself at this time is a physical tree that produces physical fruit, but it is not the physical properties, it is the higher dimensional properties of this fruit that sustain life. And again, it requires certain genetics and full spiritual alignment with the will, the divine will. And you can ascribe however many names you want to deity. It's all a personal effort to attain the unity consciousness, and Christ is key. Crystalline. Right? So it's however you want to look at it, but there's one message. And that divine will was superseded from. Eventually there's a war in heaven, and behold, Michael and his angels fought against the devil and his, and that old serpent, the devil, Lucifer, he was cast from the heavens to the earth. And these beings were cut off from that everlasting source of fruit. Not only were they no longer able to access its currents, they were no longer able to even have it because it just died. It was just gone. But it didn't matter anymore, because once you can't access it, you can't. So really what happened is there's a being who has been translated as Lucifer, and he had other beings, Satan and Beelzebub and all these different very high interdimensional beings, ID, interdimensional, ET, extraterrestrial. But yeah, so these IDs, they were not just messenger angels or chariots for souls, not to degrade our brothers and sisters by any means, but these were very high beings. These were brilliant beings, brilliant sons of light. And they became corrupted with instead of self-mastery, they chose mastery of others, rather. And that is the weak type of power, right? The strong, eternal, crystalline power is a self-mastery. It is a self-mastery, and not necessarily a self-reflection at all, but a self-knowledge and a self-awareness. You don't go looking for answers, you realize the answers are there. It's not hard to find out about yourself if you are yourself. So do it, right? But that is the human journey, and these beings, they were tasked with guiding the evolution of that journey. And once they devolved under their leaders and their superiors, these corporeal Anunnaki, they became cut off not only from the tree of life, but from all spiritual circuits, because this earth was quarantined for the sake of, obviously, the spread, because these things are viral. They're toxic. It is once, a civilization has, think about the Star Wars prequels, how the civilization of Jedi has lived in galactic harmony for thousands of years, and all it took was one Sith Lord, and suddenly it's war. Maybe it wasn't the perfect civilization before. It wasn't by any means, but it was a free, intentionally guided from the bottom up and from the top down as well, simultaneously meeting in the middle. And the other aspect which comes from the meeting in the middle is a particular type of ID, which is essentially a physical matter and semi-spiritual state modifier. So not necessarily spiritual, but non-corporeal state, but also the physical as well. And they're able to modify alongside certain spiritual circuits. If they have access to those circuits, then they can modify things. And these beings, there's a lot of angels, a third of heaven, right? A lot of IDs that were cast down, and even there were ETs that were going between worlds, because this type of rebellion has happened in other systems, particularly Draco. And it is the draconian reptilians who crash landed on the Earth because they were cut off once they landed and the quarantine went down. And they kind of it's not like they're trapped here, because they don't use a spiritual circuit to navigate. They use a space-time folding circuit, which is, it is what it is. But it's not really folding. I'm not gonna get into it, but let's just say it's a unity consciousness technology. Non-spiritual. Important to note. So, they really came into play afterwards, when, they were called in when there's this grace period in between when the Earth was quarantined and when, the rebellion started. popped off on the Earth. And a lot of wild shit happened during that time. It wasn't a super long time, but it was time. 300 years, something like that. Give or take. So, during this time, these angels, these IDs, were able to do whatever they wanted. And then, after that time, the IDs that were helping the Anunnaki, most of them were sent away. Now the higher energy ones, they remained for a time. And it is actually a particular being not associated with any religion. He did not follow any religion himself. His name was Joshua ben Joseph of Nazareth, and he experientially, in divinity and deity, cast aside all of the other ones. Now there's one more who remains. And it's not really that this being remains in a, like free to roam or anything like that. It's more like a projected presence for, legal reasons, you could say. A witness. A point of judicial contact, I guess. It's hard to explain in human terms, because our culture is, it's different, obviously. It's not very advanced, but it is based on these patterns, which you can see draconian patterns as well, because they used, this is really where the draconians came in. Once everything was shut down, they needed to use their civilization building patterns and their technology as well in order to harvest this gold, because that's all they had. They were dying. They couldn't breathe. So once the dust settled, there was a meeting, you could say, they wanted to figure out what to do, and there's really three different groups. The first group wanted to dominate the earth and subjugate humanity. The second group wanted to steward the earth and steward humanity, and give them access to technology that they were definitely not ready for at the time. But they weren't necessarily ill intent towards humanity. They were generally repentant and recognized that they had fucked up. Then there was a third group who was very repentant and recognized that the only path forward was to essentially just die and go back and hopefully be retrained for other tasks that are better suited for their level of faith. And not interfere with humanity to any degree whatsoever, not even, so much as a wave in the forest. Now, the way the war played out, the subsequent war that is written about in the Bhagavad Gita's that Oppenheimer references as the inspiration of the atomic bomb, since it is perfectly described within these 40,000-year-old texts that describe 100, 200,000, 150,000-year-old wars. So the third group is entirely annihilated. The first group, and it's interesting. I was hearing prominent world leaders today speak of how, and I'll quote, "Isn't it funny how, when you read the history books, the good guys always win?" And honestly, in the course of that, those wars, the first group definitely won. They're the ones who detonated the atomic weapons. And they were very strongly aligned with the Draconians, who gave them this technology, who developed this technology in our galaxy. It's a dark time. It's a dark period in history rather, that these weapons were used. And up until this point, Group 1 and Group 2 had existed in more or less harmony, right? They just kind of coexisted away from each other. There's little skirmishes here and there. It wasn't that big of a deal. And, something, it just escalated, right? And it was pride. And it was, look at me, look what I can do, I'm bigger than you. Woo-hoo, sort of thing. It's a damn shame, because the course of the war, although they thought they won, because they broke all these treaties by doing that, spiritual treaties as well. Well, let's just say they made a lot of enemies that day. A lot of enemies, and the Draconian Reptilians in particular, not so much the Orion ones up until that point. They had already been quite prejudiced against by the common being. A lot of people don't like him, and it's not unwarranted. Although I share much of their blood, it is understandable to me why you would find it repulsive, the way these beings at least have behaved and often do behave in a civilized society. But it is their framework that our society is built upon, and for better or worse, I don't know, I was going to say it works, but, think of, if you put it in the context of where we used to be, it's definitely better, and it's not a bad system at all. It's just not optimized. And the reason it's not optimized is because there is profit to be made in the margins, and that profit that is intentionally, it's taken away. But I want to get back into the Loosh and the gold farming. So this gold, It's Loosh. It is interdimensional mana, you could say, of some kind, and it is essentially energy, emotional energy in this case, and that is what the strain of human that they didn't create them, but out of their pride they said they created them because they bred with them, and they're not supposed to do that in their corporeal forms, and they became the Nephilim, the fallen ones, by doing so. And the offspring in particular of these elder Annunaki, who again they were Annunaki who did not give in, and on many other worlds the Annunaki do not give in. They're free of sin. They're not filled with iniquity and self-aggrandizement and domination towards the races of evolutionary mortal kind. They follow the divine will, and they're just out there doing an honest job. But these ones, they became the Nephilim because the elders died being cut off as long as they did live. The being known as Enki in the Sumerian tablets is really the one who was kind of the second group. And again, it wasn't right of them to give us as humans access to the technology that we're not ready for, and systems that we're not ready for. We need to develop our own systems, and that was what's supposed to happen. But at the same time, it was serendipitous that happened, and that we were given certain frameworks to, I guess you could say, we were given a context as a species to survive with after what happened during the war. And what happened during the war is nothing short of near extinction. Right? This is a bad, basically all of the majority of the advanced stocks were completely wiped out. All the most evolved humans at the time living in the cities, they were destroyed. But the survivors, in a lot of ways, banded together over time. Going back to the reptilian races, they, obviously ones that came from other worlds, but there was also a reptilian race that evolved on this world, and originally they felt, they were the ones who were supposed to have this world and evolve on it and be its primary species, but they just didn't. It's not their particular energy field. It's just not optimal for them, the energy of this world. And they're not harmonious in it. So, along with the other reptilians who are literally not from this world, and how they became interbred with the Nephilim, you can see how the idea of atmospheres that needed to be replenished and in a precious substance that needed to be extracted. Especially being cut off, they subsided on these energies, and the reptilians have a particularly strong ability to do so, to subside on the emotional energies, the loosh of others. It is a replenishing effect, but it is not an immortalizing effect. And they interbred for that coveted genetic trait. The Nephilim did. Now, because of that, the draconian influence, it built up in the background over the centuries and over the millennia. And suddenly there's an underground backdoor network throughout, essentially, a little bit of a third group mindset of just wanting to do the divine will. Well, that mindset persisted, but they did not breed those. So they didn't have genetic descendants, but they had intellectual descendants, spiritual ones, you could say. And those groups continue to pop up, primarily free of the influence of the draconian network, which was evolving. And it evolved after the war to be, more than draconian, and other constellations got involved. But as this network it was like a net, right? And it slowly closed around the Nephilim, and in a way, there's another secret war. And that war, it's still going on in many ways. And one of the primary tools in this war is the knowledge of the people. So one side doesn't want knowledge to persist among human races. They want us to basically be slaves, and they want to harvest our delicious emotional energy and slurp it up. Our suffering and our toil, the backbreaking labor, the mining of Loosh. And others wish for us to break free from our cycle of mortality and seek after that which is greater than this world. And there was a time when we're not ready for this. But our genetics, having been intermixed and evolving over a long time with different IDs and ETs, both planned and not planned, like the whole Adam and Eve thing. That's another thing that happened with literal, I guess you could call them both ID and ET, interdimensional / extraterrestrial, because they're from a higher form of physical world, a more perfect world, you could say. And they came for the process of genetic upliftment through what was supposed to be their offspring, but they both chose, they were misled, and they actually repented afterwards, unlike a lot of the Nephilim, obviously, and the initial Anunnaki who fell. They went and had kids with other beings. One of them had kids with a descendant of the Nephilim, and one of them had kids with, and that was Eve. And then the other one had kids with essentially another descendant of Anunnaki, but not necessarily as much Nephilim. And those started two different bloodlines that kind of came into the fray. And instead of two bloodlines with different Draconian and Orion and eventually Lyrian and Arcturian influences, there were now essentially these two wild cards. And, it's a whole nother layer of rebellion. So, essentially, for the longest time, the mystery schools were only for, essentially the only beings who ever had access to those mysteries. They were always of the bloodlines. They're the only ones. Now, after the genetic upliftment, whether or not it was meant to happen that way, humanity was still genetically uplifted by these two Adam and Eve offspring. And although, it's not as thorough as it should have been, because the actual plan, there would have been way more of them instead of just two. It's a unique variant because of the ID influence of the Nephilim in the genetics. And again, the Adam and Eve genetics are 12D coded as well, but they're obviously slightly different makeup. It's not, it's more perfect, I guess you could say. It's more full, it's more whole, it's brighter. It's higher quality, you could say that. It is more perfect. So these new bloodlines kind of, a lot of them took these mysteries and they kind of, for one reason or the other, gave them to the public a lot of the time to bring them to basically their own power fold. And there's the legend of the being Kirk, or Church, as the word is now known, literally church, who would decorate his dwelling place and make it beautiful to mortals and fill it with bountiful foods and blessings and wines that overflowed and all the beauties of the earth, and have them to come into his home, and essentially he would garnish their Loosh. That's an example that stuck around throughout history, and we now use the name for his, or the word for his name, as a word for a place of worship. Just a little bit of paganism that exists in all of the monotheistic religions of today. And that process that was started at this time around 50 to 30,000 years ago. And let's just say the way it's played out has been, it's unforeseen by both sides. And well, really, I say both sides, but it's like 4 sides, 5 sides at this point, because the reptilian species have their own agenda as well. Now, as far as the power structures and the secret societies that exist, particularly from starting in the Age of Enlightenment up until present age, I would say not necessarily this age because we're moving into a new one, but, essentially the present age. Regarding all that, and groups like the Bavarian Scrolls of the Illuminati, or the Freemasons who existed before them, the Templars, all these different orders, when it comes to prior to this time, again, the mystery schools, they were largely contained, but the symbolism, that's where all the symbols came from, because they were designed to teach technologies and methods and unlock knowledge and pathways. And all the symbols of today are very, very ancient symbols. And they're ever present. Most people don't notice how much pagan symbolism there is everywhere. Common brand names, their logos, all these different things. But at this time in the Age of Enlightenment, it became essentially the Reptilian War was won. Over the course of history, they closed their net, and they formed a new type of society on this earth, which was completely draconian, human-led. So there were, well, I wouldn't say completely led by them, because their influence was Nephilim. It was Nephilim influence, but it's not the physical Nephilim. It is also the IDs, which to differentiate between the physical corporeal Nephilim, descendants of the Annunaki who rebelled, and the rebellious interdimensionals. You would know them as devils and demons. The higher ones up are known as more as devils. And there are many demons, many demons. And there were different demons that were immediately cast away. And during the crucial time period at the start of the rebellion. But then there was other ones that remained, and they remained for, again, up until 2,000 years ago. And there were deals made with the devils, and the reptilian races became very entangled again in rebellion. So from that time, they've essentially had free reign over the earth, instead of being designated to the underworld as outcasts. And they've had free reign over humans, who they savor as prey, and as prey of all kinds. Any type of usage or depravity that you can imagine. It is in the genome. And presently, there is a treaty. It's not necessarily a treaty, common terminology. It's the agreement towards a peaceful transition of power. That group is being dissolved because it is no longer, they're essentially choosing to dissolve it because they're a very logical race and they realize it is no longer profitable for them. Humanity has evolved beyond their point of control. And that is the divine will, that they secede power. So that's what we're working on. And that is essentially a broad overview. Now remember that the Loosh harvesting is gold mining that we're supposedly created for. Is our purpose. It is our purpose to doom scroll. It is our purpose to consume mainstream media and mainstream ideologies and fashion trends and celebrity gossip. And just get lost in the sauce, because that is where our energy goes. And guess what? There's a chef behind every sauce. And there's a secret recipe that only one pair of eyes has access to. Stay safe in this world. It's a wild trip. I hope you're prepared.